My name is Susan Britch, and joining me today is Michael Wu. We are both assistant directors here at the National Office and proud members of the Division II team. Our objectives today will include the following listed here on the screen. First, taking some time to review the recent and temporary relief that was approved by the Division II Administrative Committee in response to the impact that COVID-19 has had on our student athletes' ability really to meet progress toward degree requirements during the 2019-20 academic year. We'll take some time to review that, and then we'll turn our attention forward to normal and upcoming certifications for the 2020-21 academic year by providing a general overview of our PTD requirements, and also illustrate their application with some common scenarios and case studies. So my apologies on the front end here to our institutions that operate on a quarter system out on the West Coast, as many of our slides and case studies address more of a traditional semester system. So just kind of a heads up there. But before we dig in, I'd like to provide a brief background on the recent action taken by the Division II Administrative Committee to provide blanket relief of PTD requirements for the 2019-20 academic year. Hopefully you've all heard about this and have had some time to review the details of the blanket waiver, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. But the obvious question, and one of the questions we've gotten a lot in all of this, is does the blanket waiver really apply to all Division II student athletes? And the short answer is yes, it actually does. The intention behind the decision was really to alleviate institutional burden and any confusion caused by the self-application of the previously approved waiver checklist. So during these difficult times, and really given the extreme and unprecedented interruption to campuses across the country this spring, the committee felt that temporary relief was necessary. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what the blanket waiver actually covers. You'll see it illustrated here on this slide. Essentially, this waives all credit hour and GPA requirements for the 2019-20 academic year for Division II student athletes. This includes the 9-semester, 8-quarter-hour term-by-term requirement, the 18-semester, 27-quarter, and 24-semester, 36-quarter annual credit hour requirements, as well as the minimum 2.0 GPA requirement for the academic year. This would also include transfers coming from Division II institutions who are not meeting PTD coming out of this academic year. The other thing it'll do is it will also provide relief for all transfers, 2- and 4-year transfers, your 2- and 4-year college transfers, from the need to meet the transferable 9-semester or 8-quarter hours during the last full-time term of enrollment, if the spring of 2020 was in fact the last full-time term of enrollment for those student athletes. What does it not do? Well, it does not remove the need for student athletes to be in good academic standing at your institution, or the need for student athletes to designate their degree, nor will it provide relief for 4-year transfers who are not meeting PTD requirements while they were enrolled at an institution at another division or association. So for student athletes who enrolled at Division I or Division III institutions coming to Division II, or for other student athletes who might have been enrolled at the NAIA level. So while the NCAA will not require any additional reporting or paperwork, institutions will still be required to complete eligibility lists for the upcoming year and hopefully be prepared to submit appropriate academic data as usual. So now let's take a look to see how this translates on a practical level. You will see that the chart here outlines how and when the blanket relief impacts certification on campus. So for student athletes coming out of the 2019-20 academic year with a credit hour or GPA deficiency, relief may be provided, allowing those student athletes to be eligible for the fall of 2020. So basically, relief would remove the need for student athletes to enroll in and earn credits during the summer of 2020 in order to meet the traditional requirements. We've got a lot of questions about summer terms here. So based on this relief, there would be no need for student athletes to enroll this summer unless they just wanted to. Going into the fall of 2020, however, you will be required to confirm that the student athletes are in good academic standing, and as we mentioned, that all eligibility lists are completed for all your student athletes as usual. Now, coming out of the fall 2020, student athletes will need to meet the 9-semester, 8-quarter credit hour requirement if enrolled full-time, and remain in good academic standing to be certified for the spring 2021 term. Then coming out of the 2020-21 academic year, all progress toward degree requirements must be met as usual. So this really is just temporary relief. I would also recommend that if you haven't yet, you take some time to review the Q&A and the updated chart on NCAA.org that outlines all of the actions taken by the administrative committee and how they apply. So if you have a specific fact pattern that you'd like to address, you are also welcome to reach out to your conference office. They're well informed on this topic, and submit questions if you need to through RSRO for staff's review. What types of documentation might be required? None. I think we covered that. Asking specifically about the academic recovery plan here, it's not required by the NCAA, but certainly might be a helpful tool for you guys on campus to have a plan in place for student athletes moving forward. So as you might remember, for traditional waivers, sometimes we require the academic recovery plan to be submitted to the NCAA or kept on campus. That's not required here, but certainly might be a good idea just for the student athlete's own kind of plan moving forward. Asking about grad rate and APC, asking if do we operate as usual if they were not eligible. I think that's a really great question, and as we move forward as it relates to data collection, the recommendation from our research staff was to submit data as usual, and however you would normally submit the academic data for student athletes who might have received relief through a traditional waiver, you would submit it through compliance assistant or whoever else you submit that information as usual. If questions come up as you submit data into the system itself, you can always reach out to our research staff for additional guidance. Question about good academic standing. What if a student athlete was not meeting the 2.0 GPA related to their good academic standing? Would that require summer school? That's a really great question. So the blanket waiver does not waive good academic standing, and we're going to talk about the general application of good academic standing in a minute. It may help answer your question. But if your student athletes need to enroll in summer classes to get their GPA up to be meeting good academic standing, then in those cases, we would highly recommend they do that, because this blanket waiver would not waive good academic standing on your campus. So let's shift gears for just a minute and turn our attention to applying the legislation as usual for the 2020-21 academic year and beyond. And this may help answer some of your questions. We're going to start by reviewing the legislation as it stands and provide some context with some case studies for certifications moving forward. So what the heck are PTD requirements and why are they important? Well, they're basically a set of minimum requirements that are measurable and agreed upon by the membership to help ensure that student athletes are really on a solid and consistent path that ideally will lead to an undergraduate degree within 5 years of enrollment. That's the plan, right? Well, that doesn't always happen, and sometimes there are things that get kids off track. But why are measurable requirements important? Well, a wise person once said, "A goal without a plan is just a dream." So the requirements are really meant to accomplish a few things. They outline a general plan that ensures that student athletes have the direction and the support they need to achieve their goals. They also help to ensure our student athletes are students first and actively protects the D2 philosophy of life in the balance. Finally, what they do is they really help to protect competitive equity by ensuring that all student athletes are spending equal amounts of time on academic pursuits during their sports season, not just over the summer and not just during the off season. So who ultimately is responsible to ensure that the requirements are being met? The coach, the FAR, the compliance administrator, the student athlete. Well, this is not an exhaustive list, but really it's everybody. Given all of the competing priorities, it takes a commitment from the entire village. It takes a commitment from the student athlete and everyone that works with him or her to ensure that they remain focused on the goal and have the very best shot at academic success. So when you consider the basic structure of our legislation, it was really designed to strike a balance between providing some guardrails for athletic and academic equity while allowing institutional autonomy as it relates to academic policy. So this is why when we talk about PTD requirements, there remains a carve-out for good academic standing determined by each institution that can neither be changed nor waived by the NCAA. So, however, it really the rest of the requirements, credit hours, GPA requirements and the declaration of degree remains within the governance structure of the NCAA and enforced therein. So you'll notice that in the bylaw itself, in the manual itself, good academic standing is the first located under the section of bylaw 14.4. And it requires that student athletes remain in good academic standing at their respective institutions in order to maintain access to competition. However, the devil is really in the details here, you guys. Technically, college athletics is considered an extracurricular activity. So if your institutional policy removes access to such activities, if student athletes fall out of good standing, this by definition would include intercollegiate competition. So the application here is pretty straightforward. Next slide, please, Michael. Good academic standing is not defined by the NCAA, but based on your institutional policy for all students. And it only impacts access to competition if institutional policy also restricts access to extracurricular activities. So it may be possible that student athletes who are not in good academic standing, but are not running awry of institutional policy that restricts them from extracurricular activities, would still be able to move forward and gain access to competition by meeting the other PTD requirements. It's all dependent on your institutional policy. So moving forward for student athletes who remain in good academic standing, the regular PTD requirements related to credit hours, GPA, and designation of degree start to kick in. So the question that we get a lot is what triggers what here? Keep in mind that credit hour and GPA requirements, they are triggered by a series of events, such as a full-time enrollment or the use of a season. Once a student athlete attends class as a full-time student during any regular term, the term-by-term 9-semester 8-quarter-hour requirement is triggered, period. The annual credit hour and GPA requirements are initially triggered at an institution in one of three ways. One example is when after a student athlete completes a year in residence, which by our definition is 2 full-time semesters or 3 full-time quarters, or when a student athlete is coming out of a year where he or she uses a season of competition, or after a student athlete enrolls in or transfers at mid-year. Keep in mind that in this case, for mid-year transfers or mid-year enrollees, the annual credit hour requirement is actually cut in half to 12, if you remember, as the student athlete would have only attended for half the year. So moving forward for matriculating student athletes, once they fulfill one of those specific conditions, the annual credit hour requirements and GPA requirements are triggered when a student athlete attends as a full-time student in any term during the academic year. So now let's take a look at how the 18-semester 27-quarter-hour requirement is applied during the given year, any given year. The legislation articulates that the majority of student athletes' credits be earned during the regular academic year and not over the summer, right? We want to make sure that they're not summer all-stars. And that's what it's intended to do, is ensure that student athletes are actually students during their season, or that they don't put themselves into a position that they have to play a ton of catch-up over the summer months when they should be resting. So the hours earned during the regular academic year may encompass the time frame from the start of the institution's fall term straight through spring commencement. This can include any hours earned during a J term or mini term over the holiday break. Remember, this is the 18-hour requirement. Keep in mind that if the student athlete is already earning the term-by-term requirements, 9 semester, 8 quarter hours for each full-time term, the 18-hour, 27-hour requirement can easily be met without the need for additional mini-terms. So regardless of whether you're a semester school or a quarter school, if they meet the term-by-term for each of the regular terms, there's no need for makeup during a J term or mini-term. And of course, our legislation allows for summer credits to be used to meet the 24-semester or 36-quarter-hour and GPA requirements. So pretty straightforward here. The application would remain the same for any student athlete who finds themselves not meeting the annual credit hour requirements coming out of any academic year. Well, as a general rule, as you all know, academic waiver opportunities are always available. But what if there's no mitigation for a student athlete's academic performance? Well, student athletes may be recertified at mid-year should you choose to try to do that. As illustrated by this timeline, the only credits that can't be used to meet the 18 semester and 27 quarter hour requirement, just like before, or the summer hours. So essentially, student athletes are given the same window of time to earn the needed credits, whether they're certified prior to the fall or in need of recertification at mid-year. The terms that you analyze in the certification just have to be contiguous. Hopefully the visual is helpful. Now, we certainly understand that certification isn't always that simple. Confusion can be caused by any number of things, right? Erratic or irregular enrollment, repeated courses, credits coming in from other institutions, recertifying deficiencies as we just saw, and certainly the more recent impact of COVID-19. Really the best way to deal with any of these complicated scenarios is to take a deep breath, start with the base bylaws, remember their intent, and review their application one step at a time. When all else fails, you guys, remember there are always resources available to you, staff interpretations and case precedent within the system itself you can search for, refreshing your memory by reviewing current waiver guidelines, as well as reviewing the most recent information related to COVID-19, specifically the Q&A. And there's much more information available to you on our Online Education Resource Center that is updated annually. So one last resource that I think most of you access, but a reminder that your conference office staff is always available and well equipped to offer guidance when necessary as well. So now that we've got your thinking juices going here and you're all warmed up, I'm actually going to turn this over to Michael, who will walk you through some case studies to help illustrate how our legislation is applied. Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So as Susan mentioned, we will be going through 4 total case studies, and all of which came from actual interpretations that were submitted by the membership. So these are very authentic scenarios that either yourself or your colleagues may deal with in the future or might already have experience with. For each case study, what we're going to do is walk through the narrative and cover the facts of the case. And from there, we will move on to more of an interactive visual where we'll progress through the narrative and determine solutions for each case. For all these case studies, we're going to be focusing on the different credit hour requirements, okay, so the 9, the 18, and the 24. And we'll assume that each student athlete that we talk about is in good academic standing and meeting that 2.0 GPA threshold. So let's kick it off with case study number 1 and Soccer Sam. So Sam enrolled full-time at your institution in the fall 20 term, where he competes and earns 12 credits. He then chooses to enroll part-time in the spring 21 term and earns 3 credits. And Sam is one of those summer superstars that Susan talked about before. So he comes back, enrolls in both summer sessions where he earns 12 credits. So what we're going to be looking at with this case study is Sam eligible going into the fall 21 term? So I'll leave the narrative up here just for a few more brief moments, and then we'll switch over to the interactive portion of the slide. And if you don't catch all of this information, or if you don't remember it when we move on, don't worry, we are going to be going through term by term to examine this case study. So with Soccer Sam, like we said, he enrolled initially full-time for that fall 20 term. He earns 12 credits and competes. And then he comes back in the spring term where he enrolls part-time and earns 3 credits. So we see that he earns 15 credits between the fall and the spring, and he comes back over the summer to earn an additional 12, which gets him to 27 hours for that first year. So what we're looking at is Sam eligible heading into the fall 21 term? What we want to do is really look at each of those credit hour requirements, and I do apologize to the quarter schools because we are working on semesters in these case studies. But we're going to be looking at the 9, the 18, and the 24, with that first requirement being that term-by-term requirement. And with the term-by-term, the 9 hours, we're going to be looking back at Sam's last full-time term of enrollment. So although he enrolled part-time in the spring 21 term, and that's the most recent term, we're not going to be looking at that semester for the term-by-term requirement. We're going to look back at that fall 20 term where he was enrolled full-time. He earned 12 credits, so we know that we can check the box that he earned that term-by-term requirement. The next piece that we're going to have to analyze for this case are the 18 and the 24 credit hour requirements. And the first thing that we need to establish is whether or not Sam has even triggered these requirements coming out of this first academic year. We can see that he has not yet spent a year in residence at the institution because of that part-time term in the spring. So he has only completed one full-time term so far, meaning that he hasn't triggered the year in residence yet. But what he has done in that fall 20 term is he's competed. So he's used the season of competition. Therefore, he has triggered those 18 and 24 credit hour requirements. So we can see that he earned 15 during the fall and the spring, and then he earned 27 if you include those summer hours. So that brings us back to the question of, is Sam eligible? And the answer is no. Reason being, he did not pass those 18 hours between the fall and the spring terms. Okay, so what we want to emphasize here is that satisfying the 24-hour requirement does not negate the need to satisfy the 18-hour requirement as well. Okay, this isn't a one or the other type scenario or a 2 out of 3. We need to make sure that we are certifying the student athletes for all 3 of those credit hour requirements in order for them to be marked as eligible coming out of any given term. So let's move on to case study number 2 with Football Fred. And with this case study, we're going to be looking at how to certify mid-year transfers. So Fred transfers, enrolls full-time at your institution in the spring 21 term, where he earns 9 credits, and then he earns an additional 3 over the summer. So a simple question, is Fred eligible going into the fall 21 term? So again, transfers in that spring term, enrolls full-time where he earns 9 credits, earns an additional 3 over the summer term to get to 12. So we already know that he needs to hit that term-by-term requirement. We can look back at the spring. We can see he hit 9 hours, so he checks the box with that. And for the mid-years, we know that there's one other credit hour requirement that we need to certify with them, and that's that annual credit hour requirement. But the application for this requirement here enrollee allows for that adjustment that Susan talked about before to require 12 credits per term of actual attendance during that initial year of attendance for the student athlete. And just like the 24 credit hour requirement, we can include the summer hours to get to that total. So with Football Fred, even though he only passed 9 hours in the spring, we can still combine those 9 hours with the additional 3 that he earned from the summer. That gets him to 12 total, and he hits that annual credit hour requirement. So is Fred eligible? Yes, he is. The reason why is he passed the 9 in the spring. He passed the 12 hours total prior to the fall of 2021. And for these mid-years, we do not need to certify them for the 18 credit hour requirement coming out of that initial spring term. Okay, so for that 18 semester hour requirement, these student athletes shall be certified to start each academic year based on their academic record from the previous fall, beginning the following academic year. Okay, so we will not need to certify Football Fred or any other mid-year transfer until after their second spring term at the institution. So in this case, it would be after the spring 22 term. All right, those first 2 cases were a bit of a warm-up. Now these next 2 will be a little bit more difficult. So we're going to look at volleyball Vanessa. So Vanessa enrolls full-time at your institution in the fall 20 term. She does not compete and earns 10 credits. She then chooses to enroll part-time in the spring 21 term. She still doesn't compete and earns 6 credits. She earns an additional 3 in the summer and then comes back, enrolls full-time for the fall 21 term, and competes. So what we're looking at with this case study is how many credits does Vanessa need in that fall 21 term in order to be eligible heading into the spring 22 term. Okay, with this visual, what we really want to focus on is when the different credit hour requirements are triggered, and then once those credit hour requirements are triggered, which terms are we going to pull the credits from for certification? So let's walk through this together. That first fall 20 term, she enrolls full-time, earns 10 credits, but does not compete. She comes back in the spring, enrolls part-time, earns 6 credits, still doesn't compete. So what can we establish coming out of this 2020-21 academic year with Vanessa? We know that she's on the hook for the 9 credit hours for that term by term. And we're looking back, like we did with Soccer Sam, to that last full-time term of attendance. So we can establish that she hit those 10 credit hours in fall 20, so she's good with the term by term. But now let's look at if she's triggered those 18 and those 24 credit hour requirements. We can see with the fall and the spring that she's only enrolled full-time for 1 semester, so she hasn't triggered that year in residence at the institution. And she also did not compete in the fall or the spring. So coming out of this initial academic year, we only need to certify her for those 9 credit hours. She's not on the hook for the 18 yet, and coming out of summer, she's not on the hook for the 24. So now let's move on to the fall 21 term, where she comes back, she enrolls full-time, and she competes. So we can establish that now she has triggered those 18 and 24 credit hour requirements because she spent her year in residence by completing 2 full-time terms, and she's also used a season of competition. And so now that we have established that, we need to look at which terms we're going to pull her credits from in order to certify for spring 22. So for both the 18 and 24 credit hour requirements, we're going to look at the institution's preceding regular 2 semesters or 3 quarters. In Vanessa's case, that is the spring 21 term and the fall 21 term. This analysis does not change even though Vanessa was only part-time in that spring 21 term. So for the 18 credit hour requirement, we're going to combine those hours from spring 21 and fall 21. And then for that annual 24 credit hour requirement, we can throw in those summer hours. So what does Vanessa need credit hour-wise in order to be eligible coming out of that fall 21 term? And the magic number is 15, because we know that's going to get her to the 9, no questions on that. We can add those 6 hours from the spring, and that's going to give her 21 towards the 18 credit hour requirement. And last but not least, we can add the 6 hours from the spring with the 3 hours from the summer, and lastly with those 15 credit hours from the fall, and that's going to get her right at 24 credit hours for that annual credit hour requirement. So again, just really focusing on when the different credit hour requirements are triggered, and then which terms we are pulling the credit hours from for certification. Okay. We are moving right along. This is the last case study of the day. We're going to be looking at Softball Sally. So Softball Sally, she enrolls full-time for the fall 20 term, earns 10 credits, remains enrolled full-time in the spring 21 term, where she competes and earns 6 credits. She continues full-time in the fall 21 term, earns 12 credits. 3 of those credits are repeats from the spring 20 term. She then earns an additional 6 credits during J-term classes, and for the sake of this case study, all of those credits from the J-term were completed prior to the start of the spring 22 term. So what we are going to look at is Sally eligible going into the spring 22 term? All right. So let's look back at this 2020-21 academic year first. Enrolls full-time and earns 10 credits in the fall, comes back full-time, competes, and earns an additional 6 credits in the spring. So we can already establish with Softball Sally that academically 2020-21 was not her year. Okay, we can establish that she did not meet that term-by-term requirement in the spring with only 6 credit hours. We can establish that she only hit 16 credits towards that 18 credit hour requirement between the fall and the spring. And because she didn't do anything over the summer, she still only earned 16 credit hours towards that annual requirement of 24. So we've already established she's ineligible heading into fall 21, but the question that we're looking at is she eligible heading into the spring 22 term? So again, that fall 21 term, she comes back, enrolls full-time, and earns 12 credits, and earns an additional 6 during J term. So just like the last case study with Volleyball Vanessa, with this mid-year certification, we're going to look back at the last 2 regular academic terms at the institution. So it's that spring 21 term and the fall 21 term. And with this specific case, we can also use the J term hours towards both the 18 and the 24 because those hours were completed prior to the start of that spring 22 term. So briefly, with that term-by-term credit hour requirement, we can look right at that fall 21 term and establish that she's met that with no issues. Now let's examine the 18 and the 24 because she needs to also meet both of those coming out of that fall 21 term. So if we just quickly look at the numbers on here, we can see there's 6 credits from the spring, 12 credits from that fall 21 term, and then the additional 6 from the J term that we can use. So it seems at first glance that Softball Sally should be good to go. So when we pull the numbers up here, we're only seeing 21 though. So that number on the top, that first 21, let's say that we're using that number towards the 18, and then the bottom number is towards the 24. And this is not a typo on the screen. So those are 21 credit hours and only 21 credit hours that we can use for certification heading into the spring 22 term. So is she eligible? No. And here's why. It goes back to those 3 repeat credits that we mentioned from the fall 21 term. So again, those 3 credits that she took in the fall 21 term were repeats from the spring 21 term, and you cannot count credits twice for certification. So let's say we're doing Sally's paperwork for the 18 and the 24 credit hour requirements. We jot down all 6 credit hours from the spring, then we get to adding those credit hours from the fall. We can only use 9 of those credits because we've already used those last 3 from that spring term. And you can only use them once. So therefore, we can only take 9 from the fall. You take an additional 6 from the J term, and that only gets you to 21 credit hours towards both the 18 and the 24. So Sally is not eligible coming out of that fall 21 term and heading in to that spring 22 term. So that is the last of our case studies. And what I want to do is I want to turn it back over to Susan. I know that we do have, I think, a handful of questions in the chat box, so we'd like to try to answer as many of those as we can before time runs out.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, we actually have some staff online with us helping us to field some of the questions. So we do have some follow-up questions. I think the first, more immediate one, Michael, is there is a request to go back over the volleyball student athlete, Volleyball Vanessa, if you don't mind, one more time. That would be great.
Now, was there a specific question about Volleyball Vanessa in the chat box?
I think just follow up and explain how Volleyball Vanessa got eligible, just in general.
How she got eligible. Okay. So I think it's best to go to the visual. So Vanessa initially enrolls full-time in that fall 20 term, does not compete. She comes back for the spring 21 term part-time, still does not compete. So we know that coming out of that initial academic year with Volleyball Vanessa, she's on the hook for the term-by-term. Okay, she enrolled full-time for that fall 20 term, and we know that we can certify her with those 10 credit hours towards the 9. Now with the 18 and the 24 credit hour requirements, she has not triggered those yet because she has not spent a year in residence at the institution with only 1 full-time term behind her, and she also did not compete in the fall or the spring. So she hasn't triggered that season of competition. So we don't need a certifier for the 18 or the 24 coming out of that initial academic year. But then after the fall, she comes back, enrolls full-time, and competes. So she has now triggered both the 18 and the 24 credit hour requirements. And we're looking back at the last 2 regular academic terms at the institution. So we're taking the credit hours from the spring 21 term and the fall 21 term to certify for the 18. And then we can add in those summer hours to certify for the 24 credits. And the reason why she triggered those credit hour requirements coming out of the fall is because that was she used a season of competition, and she also completed 2 full-time terms at the institution.
Okay. Hopefully that's helpful. I know this isn't ideal. There's a lot of folks that have some questions. We're going to try to address some of them that came in earlier since we have a little bit of time here. One of the questions specifically was whether or not J-term hours could be used for the term-by-term credit hour requirement. The answer to that is no. And if you think about the reasons why the term-by-term credit hour requirement exists, it's to ensure that all the student athletes are earning the same number of credits during the parameters of the regular term itself. So any credits that are earned after the end of the regular term or before the term begins can't be used to meet the term-by-term requirement, basically because it would be unfair to everybody else who is. And so those J-term credits really can be helpful for student athletes needing to get to the 18 and or 24 credit hour requirement, annual credit hour requirements there. So that was a really good question coming in. Another question here about, let's see, the blanket waiver relief specific to confirming whether or not student athletes needed to have been eligible going into the 2019-20 academic year. The answer to that is no. So if you might remember, there was some discussion before the blanket relief was actually provided that in order to use the previously approved waiver checklist, there was some discussion about student athletes needing to have been eligible going into the 2019-20 academic year. But when the D2 AdCom committee, or AdCom really took a look at it, they just felt it was just getting too complicated, and they wanted to relieve some burden on institutional campuses and for student athletes, and they made the call that essentially the blanket relief could apply to anybody, whether they had met the PTD requirements going into the academic year, or whether they were trying to get healthy during the 2019-20 academic year and weren't able to do so. Got a question about whether or not Ds can count towards certification. Well, they certainly can if your institutional policy allows it. So again, kind of like good academic standing, there are quite a few rules and regulations that the NCAA can't and won't regulate, and that's specific to what credits can count towards degree requirements. So if a student athlete earns a D, but it can't count towards their degree, and they need to retake the course, then certainly if they've already declared their degree and all credits moving forward need to be degree applicable, then the Ds can't be used. Question about if there's a maximum number of credit hours that a student athlete can take during a J term. The answer to that is no. It's kind of like summer in that way, except the summer hours cannot be used towards the 18, which is a little different application there. But there's no maximum there. Remember, the PTD requirements are minimum requirements, so student athletes can certainly earn in excess of what the requirements are if they have the time to do so, but there's no maximum there. Question about required credit hours needed within their major starting their junior year. So keep in mind our legislation allows during the first 2 years of enrollment, student athletes certification can be done using any credits towards any of the degree programs at your institution, regardless of whether a student athlete decides to declare a degree early or not. That 2-year window is really provides some flexibility for student athletes. But once they declare their degree going into their 5th semester or into the first semester of their junior year, all credit hours moving forward need to be degree applicable. And so there is some room in the legislation there for changing degrees student athletes who are maybe double majors and things like that. We get into the weeds there. But ultimately, once they get into their junior year, the student athletes really need to remain focused, and all of those credits that use towards certification need to be degree applicable. Now, there has recently been some flexibility granted to voluntary minor credits, and again, that was intended to provide student athletes with some flexibility outside of their required major to explore different areas that they might find of interest. So there are some minimums and maximums there as far as what can be used for certification, but that's really the only point of flexibility when it comes to credit hours once a student athlete declares their degree. Another question about what kind of paperwork needs to be kept on file at the institution if you're going to self-apply relief, or if a student athlete needs the blanket waiver. Again, no paperwork is necessary there, but we do recommend that you keep your student athletes' files up to date, so that if down the road you need to go back and figure out how these student athletes were able to compete while they weren't meeting the PTD requirements, you have some information there that you can access. A question on whether or not there's a limit on how many times a junior or senior can change majors. No, there are no limits. But keep in mind, the more times that student athletes change their majors, typically the further behind they get towards earning that baccalaureate degree. And so what we really want to do is try to get them to graduation within 5 years. But certainly if their interests change and they decide to go in a different direction, they're welcome to change their degree as often as they'd like. Is it possible for a partial qualifier to use the blanket waiver? It's a really good question. Again, pointing to whether or not student athletes were actually eligible for competition during the 2019-20 academic year. So that would include anybody who wasn't able to be certified academically going into the fall 2019 term, whether that's because they were continuing student athletes and hadn't earned the necessary GPA or credit hour requirements, or whether they were serving a year in residence during the 2019-20 academic year. The answer to that is yes, everybody can use the blanket waiver. So again, providing relief, temporary relief for the 2019-20 academic year covers everybody. Question about a drug test? That's a great question. I would highly recommend. We don't really probably have the time to get into the drug testing piece of this. I really recommend that you put that question in RSRO so that staff can appropriately address your question and make sure that you get an answer in writing related to those types of questions there. I would also recommend that any other questions that come to mind, especially if they're fairly complicated fact patterns that you need help working through, certainly feel free to put them through the system so that staff can address them. A reminder that we cannot certify your student athletes for you. That's something you need to do on campus, but we can certainly help you understand how the legislation applies and keep you informed and updated on the legislation itself. It can get pretty complicated and pretty deep, and so we're happy to help kind of guide you through any scenario that comes your way. So one more thing, you guys, I know these are tough times for everybody. Please stay safe and healthy so that when we're able to, we can get back together again and share some important time. So thanks again for your time today, you guys, and have a great day.